Brielle Ashford invited Damon Ellison to her wedding for one reason only, so that every member of high society in that ballroom could see the broke ex-boyfriend she had once thrown away. She seated him near the kitchen doors, printed his old job title on his place card, and prepared a toast designed to turn his past into a punchline. But the moment the groom raised his glass, 6 black SUVs pulled up outside the hotel. Bodyguards in dark suits stepped out in formation, opened the rear door, and addressed the man inside, with 2 words that drained the color from her father's face. Chairman Ellison has arrived. Subscribe now, because Damon's arrival was only the opening move in a collapse that would tear the entire wedding apart before the night was over. 3 weeks before the wedding, a cream-colored box arrived at Damon's private office, and inside it sat a wedding invitation bearing the names of Brielle Ashford and Grant Sterling. What struck him immediately was the address. The card had not been sent to the headquarters of Ellison Meridian Group, where his name appeared on the top-floor directory. It had been sent to the small apartment he lived in 8 years earlier, a detail that told him someone had gone digging through old records just to make a point. Beneath his printed name, Brielle had added a handwritten line in her familiar slanted script, telling him she thought he should come and see that everything had finally turned out exactly the way it was supposed to. Damon read those words twice and understood immediately that this was not an olive branch. This was an invitation to be put on display, a quiet trophy from a woman who wanted the room to see exactly how far she believed she had climbed above him. 8 years earlier, Damon had been an engineer who had just lost his job, pouring every dollar he had left into a fraud detection system that nobody believed in yet. Brielle used to tell him she had faith in him, but the moment he could no longer afford the lavish vacations her friends took for granted, something in her began to shift. Her parents never stopped reminding her that Damon was using her, and Conrad Ashford himself once offered Damon money to simply disappear from his daughter's life. Damon refused that offer without hesitation, choosing his pride over a payout that would have solved nothing. A few months later, Brielle ended things in a crowded restaurant, leaning across the table to tell him that love could not pay the bills, a sentence that lodged itself somewhere deep and stayed there for years afterward, quiet but never fully healed. Back in the present, Harper Sloan urged Damon not to attend the wedding at all. Ellison Meridian Group was finalizing a massive acquisition of distressed debt connected to Ashford Grand Hotels, and if Damon walked into that ballroom, his identity as the buyer could surface far earlier than planned. Then Damon noticed the groom's name printed beneath Brielle's, and the pieces shifted into place. Sterling Capital Holdings was the very firm circling Ashford Grand, the one applying pressure that was slowly pushing the company toward collapse. This wedding, he realized, was never just a marriage ceremony. It was the final piece of a hostile takeover dressed up in white flowers and crystal chandeliers. And Brielle had no idea she was standing at the center of it. Damon set the invitation down and told Harper he would attend, but not for Brielle. Within the hour, Harper reported that someone inside Sterling Capital had quietly delivered a confidential file straight to their offices, the kind of document that could change everything before the first dance ever began. The wedding itself was staged at Ashford Grand Crown, the crown jewel of the family's hotel empire, dressed for the occasion in white roses, hanging crystal, and gold family crests mounted above every doorway. Bankers, investors, minor celebrities, and chief executives filled the guest list, every name chosen to reinforce the idea that Brielle had married into the highest tier of power this city had to offer. Lydia Ashford personally arranged the seating chart, and she made certain that Damon was placed at table 29, tucked beside the kitchen entrance among contract staff and event vendors who had no business cards worth mentioning. On his place setting, his occupation was printed as former freelance technician, a label Lydia knew was years out of date, but she kept it anyway because she wanted every guest to believe Damon was still the struggling man Brielle had left behind. Grant had prepared a slideshow chronicling his love story with Brielle, and tucked inside it was an old photograph of Damon standing beside a car that had clearly broken down on the side of some forgotten road, presented as a visual lesson on the wrong choices a woman makes before she finds real love. In a private office upstairs, Grant pressed Conrad to sign a document, transferring control of several Ashford Grand assets over to Sterling Capital, framing it as a routine protection measure following the wedding. Conrad, believing Grant was rescuing the family from looming bankruptcy, signed without reading every line, while Grant had already instructed his team to finalize a complete buyout the moment the ink dried. Brielle herself knew none of these details. She believed the Sterling family was simply investing in her father's company, certain that her marriage was securing both love and legacy in one elegant gesture. And when a bridesmaid asked why on earth she had invited her broke ex, Brielle smiled and said that sometimes a person needs to look back at where they started to appreciate how far they have come. When word reached the wedding party that Damon had not yet arrived, Grant assumed embarrassment had finally driven him to skip the event entirely. But down in the hotel's basement, Harper discovered that every security camera had just been disconnected by someone working for Sterling Capital, a detail far too deliberate to be a coincidence. Damon arrived alone in an ordinary sedan, long before the official convoy made its entrance, dressed in a simple dark suit with no flashy watch and no entourage trailing behind him. He wanted to see, just once, how people would treat him when they had no idea who he had become. The front desk staff checked his name twice before pointing him toward the vendor entrance, and an event manager informed him that guests seated at table 29 were expected to enter through a side door so they would not interfere with the photography near the main staircase. Damon said nothing. He simply absorbed every detail, filing it away the way he filed away every piece of evidence that crossed his desk back home. Brielle spotted him from across the lobby and seemed almost pleased that he had arrived without a date, walking over to offer a polite embrace, while her eyes quietly assessed the fabric of his suit for any sign of cheapness. She told him she was glad to see he had settled down a bit, her tone laced with pity rather than warmth, and asked if he was still fixing rented computers for a living. Damon answered simply that he still solved problems other people could not, a line Brielle interpreted as quiet denial, rather than the understatement it actually was. Grant arrived next, shaking Damon's hand with a grip deliberately too firm, thanking him sarcastically for helping Brielle realize she deserved something better. He even offered to recommend Damon for maintenance work at one of the family's hotels once the honeymoon ended. And when Damon politely declined, Grant announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear that smart men should know when to accept charity. A ripple of laughter passed through the small crowd. While the conversation continued, Damon noticed Grant glancing repeatedly at his phone, exchanging quick signals with Ashford Grand's chief financial officer. And a message from Harper confirmed that transfer documents were being prepared for signature that very night. Damon understood immediately that Grant intended to complete the takeover before the markets opened the next morning. Brielle eventually led him to the table beside the kitchen and pointed at the place card with its outdated title, telling him she hoped he wouldn't feel awkward, since seating had simply been arranged according to each guest's social standing. Damon studied the card for a long moment before sitting down without complaint. Outside, 6 black SUVs were already turning onto the avenue leading toward the hotel. Few guests at his table bothered speaking to him throughout the early part of the reception, and one even asked outright whether he had come hoping for a handout. Damon let the comment pass, choosing instead to study how completely this room sorted human beings by reputation and net worth. Hotel staff grew visibly tense as payment systems and internal access controls began glitching throughout the evening, a sign Damon recognized instantly as Grant quietly siphoning funds and data out of Ashford Grand's network in real time. When Grant stood to deliver his toast, hundreds of guests turned their attention toward him as he described the wasted years Brielle had spent with a man lacking any sense of direction before she finally found someone worthy of her. A photograph of Damon beside the broken-down car flashed across the screen behind him, and laughter rippled through the crowd while Brielle did nothing to stop it, smiling faintly as the camera operator turned toward Damon's table. Grant raised his glass directly at him, thanking him for failing so spectacularly that Brielle finally understood what a successful man actually looked like. Damon did not rise to defend himself. He simply watched Brielle's expression and understood, with total clarity, that she had not invited him here to close an old chapter. She had invited him to use his humiliation as decoration for her own victory lap. A message from Harper arrived on his phone confirming every figure had been verified, showing that Grant had quietly moved $86 million out of Ashford Grand over the past 6 months. Damon typed a single word in reply, "Proceed," and within minutes the sound of engines rumbled outside the main entrance. 6 black SUVs lined up along the red carpet, and several guests assumed a governor or visiting celebrity had arrived. Noah Briggs stepped out first, followed by a disciplined team of suited security personnel, who swept the entrance, the elevators, and the main hallway with practiced precision. When the event manager tried to stop them, Noah simply presented a corporate-level security authorization that ended the conversation instantly. Noah crossed the ballroom floor, passing hundreds of stunned guests, and walked directly to the table beside the kitchen. He bowed his head slightly toward Damon and announced, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, that the legal team and Mrs. Kingsley had arrived, and that everything was ready whenever the chairman wished to begin. The entire room fell silent. The glass in Conrad Ashford's hand slipped slightly against the table, and for the first time all evening, nobody in that ballroom was laughing. Guests who had mocked Damon moments earlier began checking their phones frantically, and his name surfaced instantly across financial news archives, identifying him as the founder of Ellison Meridian Group, a multibillion-dollar firm managing financial security and risk for some of the largest banks in the country. One guest recalled seeing him speak at a closed-door investment conference months earlier, and the man who had asked if Damon needed money quietly slipped away from the table without another word. Brielle assumed this had to be some elaborate setup, demanding to know why Damon had never mentioned any of this to her. He reminded her calmly that they had not spoken in 8 years, and that she had never once asked how his life had unfolded after she walked away. When she pointed out that he had practically nothing back when they parted, Damon answered that having nothing and being worth nothing were 2 entirely different things, a sentence that struck directly at the arrogance she had built her entire identity around. Victoria Kingsley entered next, flanked by her legal team and several members of the Ashford Grand Board, shaking Damon's hand in front of every guest and thanking him publicly for exposing a massive fraud scheme that had nearly crippled her bank the previous year. She confirmed openly that Ellison Meridian Group had just acquired the majority of Ashford Grand's outstanding debt, meaning Damon now held direct influence over the very future of the hotel hosting this wedding. Conrad pulled Damon aside and asked bluntly how much money it would take for him to leave quietly and keep the financial details out of the public eye. Damon reminded him that 8 years earlier, this same man had once offered him money to disappear from Brielle's life entirely. Conrad insisted he had only been protecting his daughter, but Damon corrected him, saying he had only been protecting his own sense of superiority. Still, Damon clarified that he had not come to destroy the Ashford family. He had come to stop Grant Sterling from taking everything that remained. Grant tried to seize the narrative, accusing Damon of using the wedding as an act of jealous revenge against his former girlfriend, suggesting he had purchased the debt purely out of bitterness. For a few tense minutes, the accusation seemed to land, and Brielle's expression shifted as doubt crept in. Grant then produced a folder of transfer documents and demanded Conrad sign them immediately in front of witnesses, hoping to lock in the deal before anyone could stop him. Damon studied the folder briefly before responding that Conrad was welcome to sign, but that Grant might first want to explain why Conrad's signature had already appeared on an identical copy filed 3 days earlier. The smile vanished from Grant's face instantly. Harper projected the evidence for the room to see, documents proving Grant had forged Conrad's signature to transfer key assets into a shell company tied indirectly back to Sterling Capital. Grant insisted this was merely an internal draft, but Harper countered with timestamps, server records, and a transaction history proving the documents had already been used to secure outside loans. Damon explained that Grant had spent months quietly sabotaging Ashford Grand from the inside, inflating operating costs, canceling profitable contracts, and redirecting major clients toward properties owned by his own family. Once the hotel chain stood on the edge of insolvency, Grant arrived as its supposed savior, and marrying Brielle gave him a path to the family's shares without ever needing to launch a public takeover bid. Brielle asked Grant directly whether he had ever truly loved her, and he dodged the question, insisting every decision he made was meant to secure their future together. Damon did not involve himself in matters of the heart. He asked only one question: whether Grant would still be standing at this altar today if the Ashford family did not own these hotels. Grant offered no answer, and the silence told Brielle everything she had been too afraid to admit to herself. Grant still believed he held leverage through Sterling Capital's right of first refusal on the remaining debt, but Victoria announced that Ellison Meridian had already purchased that exact right from an intermediary bank earlier that very morning. Grant no longer had any meaningful control over Ashford Grand, and the bank accounts tied to his shell companies had already been frozen pending a civil investigation. He attempted to send an assistant to retrieve a laptop containing the transaction data before anyone could review it, but Noah's team intervened without raising a hand, presenting a court-approved data preservation order instead. The laptop was sealed in front of both legal teams, and Grant, losing his composure, accused Damon of orchestrating the entire scene out of jealousy. Brielle looked at Damon as though hoping he might finally admit he still loved her, but he made his position clear, telling her he had not come to win her back. He had come for the thousands of employees who did not deserve to lose their jobs because of the greed of the man standing beside her. The comment forced Brielle to confront, once again, how badly she had misjudged him. Harper handed Damon one final document, an email Brielle herself had sent to Grant 6 months earlier, revealing financial weaknesses inside her family's company. Damon looked at her and asked plainly how much of this plan she had actually known about from the beginning. Brielle admitted she had shared certain details with Grant, believing at the time he was simply helping restructure the business. She insisted she never imagined he would use that information to push the company toward collapse, though she also confessed she had hidden the severity of the crisis from her own father, terrified he would decide she lacked the competence to one day lead the company herself. Damon pointed out that her mistake had nothing to do with intelligence. It came from her obsession with proving she belonged among the wealthy and powerful, the very obsession that had once driven her to abandon him simply because he lacked the right last name and the right tailored suits. Conrad attempted to shift all the blame onto his daughter, but Damon stopped him, reminding the older man that he himself had built a culture where appearances mattered more than competence. Conrad had spent years firing managers who dared to raise warning signs while rewarding anyone who carried the right pedigree, and Grant had simply exploited the weakness Conrad created. For the first time that evening, Conrad had nothing to say in his own defense. Brielle removed her ring and handed it back to Grant. He warned her that without Sterling Capital backing them, the Ashford family would lose everything. But Damon confirmed that Ashford Grand could still be saved, just not under its current leadership. Brielle asked what his terms would be, and Damon laid them out clearly. Conrad would step down as chief executive. An independent board would take over major decisions. Every transaction connected to Sterling Capital would be investigated in full. Brielle would not inherit a leadership position simply because she carried the Ashford name. Employees who had previously raised concerns and lost their positions for it would be reinstated immediately, and the hotel chain would end any practice of treating guests differently based on appearance or social standing. Lydia objected loudly, accusing Damon of trying to seize the family legacy for himself. Damon simply gestured toward his place card, still resting on the table near the kitchen entrance, and told her that she had arranged this entire room according to what she believed each person was worth, and he was only correcting that valuation. Nobody in the Ashford family found anything left to laugh about. Brielle agreed to his terms, but asked whether she would ever have a chance to make up for everything that had happened. Damon told her that opportunity was not something he could simply hand to her. She would have to earn it through her own actions from this point forward. Before the moment could settle, Grant announced that Damon had not won yet, claiming he still held a secret capable of costing Ellison Meridian its largest contract. Grant produced a separate set of documents, alleging that Damon had used insider information to purchase Ashford Grand's debt in the first place. If true, the accusation could trigger an investigation and unravel the entire acquisition. A few board members visibly hesitated, and Grant, sensing an opening, demanded Damon's security team leave the premises immediately. Damon showed no surprise whatsoever. Harper proved within minutes that the documents Grant presented had been created on a Sterling Capital computer the night before, a detail that exposed the forgery instantly. Damon had already reported his entire acquisition process to regulators weeks earlier, and Victoria confirmed that Kingsley Crown had executed the deal through an independent bidding process, with no improper access to confidential information whatsoever. Then Caleb Wren, Ashford Grand's chief financial officer, stepped forward. He had stayed silent for months out of fear that Grant would destroy his career. But after receiving whistleblower protection through an agreement with Ellison Meridian, he produced a recording of Grant directly instructing staff to falsify financial reports. The recording contained no threats of violence, only cold, calculated instructions, but it was more than enough to confirm Grant had deliberately driven down the value of Ashford Grand from the inside. One by one, the partners who had been standing beside Grant all evening began stepping away from him. Conrad ordered him to leave the hotel immediately. Grant turned on Brielle, accusing her of betrayal and warning that she would be left with nothing once he was gone. She answered that she would rather start over from absolutely nothing than spend the rest of her life inside an empire built entirely on lies, a truth she had lacked the courage to embrace 8 years earlier when she chose status over the man who actually loved her. Damon had every opportunity to humiliate Grant in front of the entire room, but he chose restraint, instructing his legal team to proceed strictly through proper channels. He delivered no victory speech and allowed no rough treatment from his security detail. His composure made Grant's collapse feel even smaller by comparison, a quiet defeat playing out under bright chandeliers in front of everyone who had once admired him. Grant walked out of the ballroom surrounded by total silence from the very people who had toasted him just an hour earlier. As Damon prepared to leave as well, Brielle called out his name, asking why he had still chosen to save Ashford Grand after everything her family had put him through. Damon told her plainly that he had not come to save the Ashford family at all. He had come for the housekeepers, the chefs, the drivers, the front desk staff, all the people who had spent years building this hotel chain without ever once being invited into a room like this one. They did not deserve to lose their livelihoods simply because wealthy people had turned a company into a chessboard. He admitted that some small part of him had wanted Brielle to witness his success, but standing in that ballroom, he realized her approval no longer carried the weight it once had over him. Brielle apologized for turning him into a punchline at her own wedding, confessing she had only invited him to prove to herself that leaving him had been the right decision. Damon accepted her apology, but acceptance did not erase the consequences already set in motion. He did not return to her, and he made no promises about any kind of future together. She would have to rebuild her place within the family business as an ordinary candidate, with no inherited privileges and no guaranteed title waiting for her. Conrad asked whether Damon intended to keep him on as a consultant in some capacity, and Damon declined. The company needed people with genuine competence to repair what had been broken, not the architect of the very culture that allowed Grant to exploit it. Still, Damon did not strip the Ashford family of everything. He allowed them to retain a modest stake in the company, contingent on full cooperation with the ongoing investigation, an arrangement rooted in fairness rather than pity. Before leaving the ballroom, Damon lifted his place card from table 29 and set it down in front of Brielle. He told her this was the man she believed he would remain forever, and that she should keep it as a reminder of how badly a person can misjudge someone else's worth. Then he walked out into the night. This time, No one in that room was laughing. 6 months later, Ashford Grand operated under an entirely new board of directors. Caleb Wren was named interim chief executive, and many of the employees once pushed aside for asking inconvenient questions found themselves restored to meaningful roles within the company. Conrad withdrew from the business world altogether, while Lydia stopped appearing at the social events she once treated as her personal stage. Grant and several Sterling Capital executives faced civil litigation alongside a deepening financial investigation, and though the legal consequences unfolded slowly, the reputation he had spent years constructing collapsed entirely within weeks. Brielle began working at a smaller hotel within the company's network, taking on an operations management role and reporting directly to people her family had once dismissed without a second thought. She did not transform into a different person overnight, but for the first time in her life, she started judging people by what they actually did, rather than the names attached to them. Damon continued running Ellison Meridian Group exactly as he had before any of this began. During a reopening ceremony at the very hotel where the wedding once took place, he walked through the same ballroom where table 29 used to sit, now removed entirely. The kitchen entrance no longer serving as a doorway for guests deemed unworthy of the main hall. Noah asked whether he wanted the convoy waiting out front as usual, and Damon glanced toward the entrance before shaking his head, choosing instead to leave in a single ordinary car, just as he had arrived that night so many months earlier. The convoy that once silenced an entire wedding had never been proof of Damon's true worth. It was simply the moment that finally forced a room full of arrogant people to see what they had been too blind to recognize all along. Damon had never become valuable the day he became wealthy. He had always carried that value within him. The Ashford family had simply taken far too long to notice it.